The fluorescent light in storage unit 247 flickers overhead as I stand frozen, staring at what my husband has hidden from me for 20 years. My name is Elena Martinez. I'm 52 years old, and until this moment, I thought I knew everything about the man I've been married to for 25 years. David always said it was just business equipment in here. "Nothing important, Elena," he'd tell me whenever I asked about this place. "Just old files and construction tools cluttering up space." But David forgot his keys this morning, rushing around our kitchen like a man with secrets burning holes in his pockets. In his panic, he left behind the spare key to this storage unit, the key I'm holding in my trembling hand right now. The metal door rolls up with a grinding screech that echoes through the empty facility. What I find inside makes my legs buckle, and my 25 years of marriage crumble into dust. Dozens of cardboard boxes line the walls, each one carefully labeled with a woman's name written in David's familiar handwriting. Carmen, Lisa, Michelle, Jennifer, Maria, Rachel. Names I don't recognize, but names that apparently mean everything to my husband. More than I ever did. My hands shake as I open the first box marked Carmen. Inside, I find intimate photographs of David with a young woman, her dark hair cascading over bare shoulders. Love letters written in his handwriting, promising her things he never promised me. Jewelry receipts from stores I've never been to, for pieces I've never worn. Hotel receipts spanning months, sometimes overlapping with family vacations we took together. The second box, labeled Michelle, contains similar treasures of betrayal. Photos of David at restaurants I suggested we try, but he always said he was too busy for date nights with me. A pregnancy test. Positive. My stomach lurches as I realize David might have other children I don't know about. Box after box reveals the same pattern. My husband, the man who claimed he was working late to provide for our family, was actually building separate lives with women whose names I'm learning for the first time in this cold, concrete tomb of lies. But it's the leather journal in the final box that destroys me completely. David's handwriting documents every affair, every lie, every moment he chose someone else while I waited at home with dinner getting cold. The earliest entry is dated 23 years ago, just 2 years after we married. 2 years after I quit teaching to support his construction business. 2 years after I thought we were building something beautiful together. I sink to the concrete floor, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's double life, and whisper the words that will haunt me forever. 25 years of marriage, and I never knew who I was really sleeping next to. The woman who walked into this storage unit was a devoted wife and mother who believed in her marriage. The woman sitting here now realizes she's been living with a stranger who wore my husband's face. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. This is the story of how I discovered my entire life was built on lies, and how those lies became the foundation for the strongest version of myself I've ever been. Looking back now, I realize how perfectly crafted my illusion was. For 25 years, I believed I was living the American dream that so many women my age could only wish for. David Martinez wasn't just my husband. He was my partner, my provider, the foundation upon which I built my entire identity as a woman, wife, and mother. Our story began like a fairy tale. I was 27, a third-grade teacher in San Antonio, when I met David at my friend Rosa's backyard barbecue. He was 30, ruggedly handsome in that way construction workers are, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work and dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. When he asked me to dance to the mariachi music echoing through the neighborhood, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. "You're going to change my life, Elena," he whispered in my ear that first night, and God help me, I believed him. We married 18 months later in a ceremony at Our Lady of Guadalupe, surrounded by family and friends who all agreed we were perfect together. David's construction business was just getting started, and I threw myself into supporting his dreams with the same passion I'd once reserved for my classroom. I quit teaching without a second thought. David needed me, and being needed felt like love. Our daughter Sophia arrived 2 years later, followed by Miguel 3 years after that. Those early years were a blur of diapers and baby food, but also of building something together. While David worked job sites during the day, I managed the business from our home office. I answered phones with my cheerful Martinez Construction, Elena speaking, scheduled appointments, managed the books, and handled client relations. Every invoice that went out, every satisfied customer, every dollar that came in, I had my fingerprints all over it. "We make a good team, mi amor," David would tell me, kissing my forehead as I balanced ledgers at our kitchen table after putting the kids to bed. And I believed we did. I was the backbone of our operation, the steady presence that kept everything running smoothly while David charmed clients and managed crews. Our life had a rhythm that felt safe and predictable. David left for job sites at 6 in the morning, lunch packed with a handwritten note I'd slip into his toolbox. "Have a great day, mi amor. The kids and I love you." I'd spend my mornings managing business calls, afternoons helping Sophia with homework and driving Miguel to soccer practice. Evenings meant family dinners around our dining room table, sharing stories about our days. "Tell Daddy about the castle you built in art class today, mija," I'd encourage Sophia, watching David's face light up with pride. These moments felt sacred, proof that all my sacrifices were worth it. Weekends were for family barbecues in our backyard, Sunday Mass at Our Lady of Guadalupe, and planning for the future we were building together. David and I would sit on our front porch after the kids went to bed, talking about expanding the business, maybe buying a vacation home in Corpus Christi, planning for our retirement. 30 more years, and we'll be sitting on a beach somewhere, watching our grandchildren play in the sand, David would say, his arm around my shoulders as we watched our neighbors' evening routines unfold. I felt so grateful for what we'd built. Beautiful house in a safe neighborhood, kids excelling in school, a successful family business that supported our comfortable lifestyle. I was proud to be David's wife, proud of the sacrifices I'd made to help him succeed. I thought I was living every woman's dream of partnership and love. How wrong I was. The first crack in my perfect world appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months ago. I was organizing David's home office, something I did weekly to keep our business paperwork in order, when I found a receipt tucked between some invoices. Storage Max Self-Storage, monthly rental fee for Unit 247, $120 automatically charged to our business credit card. I stared at the receipt, confused. We'd never rented a storage unit before. Our 2-car garage held David's work tools and equipment just fine, and our house had plenty of closet space. When David came home that evening, I approached him with the receipt in hand, expecting a simple explanation. "David, honey, what's the storage unit charge? I don't remember us discussing renting one." He barely glanced up from his phone, where his fingers were moving quickly across the screen in what looked like a text conversation. "It's just business equipment and old files, Elena. Nothing important. The garage is getting too cluttered with all the new tools." Something about his tone made me pause. David had always involved me in business decisions, big and small. We'd discuss everything from which suppliers to use to whether we needed new equipment. The idea that he'd rent storage space without mentioning it felt strange, out of character. "Well, maybe I could help you organize it," I offered, setting down the receipt on his desk. "You know how good I am at filing systems. We could probably fit more in there if we organize it properly." David's reaction was swift and sharp. His head snapped up from his phone, and for just a moment, I saw something flash across his face. Panic, maybe, or irritation. "I've got it handled, Elena. You've got enough to worry about with the house and managing the business calls. I don't need you organizing my storage space." The dismissal stung more than it should have. In 25 years of marriage, David had never shut me out of anything business-related. I was the one who organized everything, who could find any document within minutes, who kept track of details he often forgot. Why wouldn't he want my help now? "But David, if it's business equipment, shouldn't I know what's in there? What if a client needs something and you're not available?" "Elena, please." His voice carried an edge I rarely heard. "Can you just trust me to handle this one thing? It's really not that complicated." I backed down, but the feeling of being dismissed lingered like a bad taste. That night, lying in bed while David scrolled through his phone beside me, I found myself staring at the ceiling and wondering why something so simple felt so wrong. Over the following weeks, I noticed David's phone habits changing. He'd always been casual about his phone, leaving it on counters, asking me to check messages when his hands were dirty from work. Now, he kept it close, face down, password protected in a way it had never been before. "Work stuff," he'd say when I'd catch him typing quickly, a small smile playing at his lips, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I cared to remember. Late one evening, I heard David on a phone call in his office, speaking in a low voice I had to strain to hear. "I can't tonight, I told you. Elena's here, maybe this weekend when she visits her sister." When I asked him about it later, he claimed it was a difficult client who demanded evening consultations. But something in my gut whispered that my husband was lying to me. The changes didn't happen all at once. If they had, maybe I would have noticed sooner, would have trusted my instincts instead of making excuses for the man I'd loved for 25 years. Instead, David's emotional withdrawal happened like water slowly draining from a bathtub, so gradual that by the time I realized I was sitting in emptiness, I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had started. It began with the conversations. David had always been a talker, sharing stories from job sites, complaining about difficult clients, asking my opinion on business decisions. Our evening routine used to include him collapsing into his recliner after dinner, telling me about his day while I cleaned up the kitchen. "You won't believe what happened with the Henderson project today," he used to begin, launching into detailed accounts of workplace drama or construction challenges that I'd help him solve over coffee. Now, when I'd ask, "How was your day?" David would barely look up from his phone. "Fine." "Just fine? What did you work on? How did the Martinez job go?" "It went fine, Elena." "Do we have to do this every night?" The question hit me like a slap. Do this every night? When had caring about his life become an interrogation? When had my interest in his world become a burden he had to bear? The physical distance followed the emotional one. David started working later, claiming new clients demanded evening meetings. 3 nights a week turned into 4, then 5. I'd set 2 places at our dining room table, then quietly put one away when 8 o'clock became 9 o'clock, became 10 o'clock. "Sorry, mi amor, the Johnson project ran late," he'd say, kissing my forehead with lips that felt cold and distracted. "Did you save me a plate?" I always saved him a plate. I always waited up, no matter how late, because that's what wives do. But sitting alone in our kitchen, reheating his dinner for the 3rd time that week, while listening to the silence of our empty house, I began to feel like a ghost haunting my own life. Our intimate moments became scheduled inconveniences. David would come to bed after I was asleep, leave before I woke up. When I'd try to initiate affection, reaching for him in the darkness of our bedroom, he'd pat my hand like I was a child asking for attention. "I'm exhausted, Elena. These job sites are killing me." But when his phone buzzed at midnight, he was suddenly alert, grabbing it quickly and typing responses with energy he claimed he didn't have for me. The worst part was how he made me feel like I was asking for too much. When I suggested we have a date night, just the 2 of us, David would sigh like I'd requested something unreasonable. "We don't need to go out to spend time together, Elena. We live in the same house." When friends at church asked where David was during coffee hour after Mass, I'd make excuses. "He's working so hard on this big project," I'd say, smiling while something inside me withered. Maria, my friend from the Altar Society, pulled me aside one Sunday. "Elena, you look tired, mija. Is everything okay at home?" I wanted to tell her that I felt invisible in my own marriage, that the man I'd built my entire life around seemed to barely tolerate my presence. Instead, I said what wives are supposed to say. "Everything's perfect, Maria. David's just busy with work." But nothing felt perfect. Nothing felt like anything at all. The humiliation that shattered what was left of my confidence happened at our church's annual fundraising dinner, an event I'd been looking forward to for weeks. It was supposed to be our first real date night in months, and I'd spent the afternoon getting ready with a care I hadn't shown myself in a long time. I'd bought a new dress, a deep blue that Sophia said brought out my eyes, and spent an hour on my hair and makeup. Looking in the mirror, I saw glimpses of the woman I used to be, the woman who felt beautiful and cherished. I was determined to reclaim my place beside the man I'd loved for 25 years. David was supposed to pick me up at 6. At 6:15, I called his phone and got voicemail. By 6:30, I was standing in our living room, watching other couples arrive at the church through our front window, feeling foolish in my carefully chosen outfit. David finally arrived at 6:45, rushing through our front door with his tie still undone and his hair damp from a hurried shower. "Sorry, mi amor, the site ran late," he said, barely looking at me as he fumbled with his tie. "We need to leave right now or we'll miss the blessing." No comment about how I looked, no acknowledgement that I'd been waiting, worried something had happened to him. Just irritation that time was slipping away from him. We arrived at the church hall 20 minutes late, slipping into seats at the back while Father Rodriguez was already delivering the opening prayer. I felt the eyes of our friends and neighbors as we found our table, embarrassed by our tardiness and David's obvious distraction. Throughout dinner, David's phone buzzed constantly in his jacket pocket. Each time, he'd glance at me with guilty eyes before sneaking a look at the screen. And each time he looked at that phone, his expression would change. A softness would cross his face, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. "David, could you please put that away?" I whispered during the salad course, trying to keep my voice light. "We're at church." "It's a potential client, Elena. This could be a big contract," he said. But even as he spoke, his thumb was already moving across the screen, typing a response with the kind of attention he used to give only to me. The breaking point came when Father Rodriguez approached our table during dessert. "David, I wanted to follow up on our conversation last week about the storage expansion project. Your wife, Elena, had such wonderful ideas about how your company could help with our new storage needs." I watched David's face go completely blank. He looked from Father Rodriguez to me, clearly having no memory of the conversation. The truth was, I'd been the one to approach Father Rodriguez after Mass 2 weeks ago, suggesting that Martinez Construction could donate labor for the church's storage building project. I'd been the one to discuss timelines, materials, and logistics. "Right, yes," David stammered, his face flushing red. "Elena handles a lot of the administrative details. I'll have her call you with the specifics." Administrative details. 25 years of partnership, of building his business from nothing, of managing client relationships and project coordination, reduced to administrative details. As if I was his secretary, not his wife. As if the ideas and relationships I'd cultivated were just paperwork he could delegate. Father Rodriguez looked confused but smiled politely. "Of course, Elena, you always have such thoughtful insights." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and small talk. I felt smaller with each passing hour. The breaking point came the morning after the church dinner, when I woke up determined to save my marriage. I'd spent the entire night replaying Father Rodriguez's confused expression, David's dismissive words, and the growing chasm between us. I convinced myself that if I could just talk to David honestly, openly, we could find our way back to each other. I made his favorite breakfast, huevos rancheros with fresh salsa and perfectly toasted bolillos, and waited for the right moment. When David came downstairs, already checking his phone, I took a deep breath and chose vulnerability over pride. "David, we need to talk." He didn't look up from his screen. "Can it wait? I've got the Morrison job starting today, and the crew's already calling with questions." "It's been waiting for months," I said softly, my hands trembling slightly as I poured his coffee. "I feel like we're growing apart, mi amor, like we're strangers living in the same house." Finally, David looked at me, but his expression wasn't the concern or love I'd hoped for. It was irritation, as if my pain was an inconvenience in his schedule. "Elena, what do you want me to say? We've been married 25 years. This is what marriage looks like. Not everything has to be romance and flowers." "I'm not asking for flowers," I said, sitting across from him at our kitchen table, where we'd shared thousands of meals, made countless plans, raised our children. "I'm asking for you to see me, to talk to me, to want to spend time with me." David sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that made me feel like a burden. "Look, not everyone needs constant attention and validation like you do. Some of us have real responsibilities. The words hit me like a physical blow. Real responsibilities. As if the 25 years I'd spent supporting him, building his business, raising his children, managing his life weren't real. As if my need for basic human connection from my husband was some character flaw I needed to overcome. Real responsibilities? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. David, I've been working beside you for 25 years. I've sacrificed my career, Sacrifice? David interrupted, his voice sharp. Elena, you answer phones and do some bookkeeping. That's not exactly a career sacrifice. Each word was designed to diminish me, to make me feel small and ungrateful. The business I'd helped build from nothing, the client relationships I'd cultivated, the financial management that kept us profitable, all reduced to answering phones. I tried one more time, my voice breaking. Could we maybe go to counseling together? Just try to reconnect? David was already standing, grabbing his keys and phone. I don't have time for this right now, Elena. Can we talk later? We never talk later, I said, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. We never talk at all anymore. David, I feel invisible in my own marriage. He paused at the kitchen door, and for a moment I thought he might turn around, might see the woman who loved him breaking apart in front of him. Instead, he said, maybe if you had your own life, you wouldn't need mine so much. That evening, David didn't come home at all. No call, no text, no explanation. I sat in our living room until midnight, then moved to our bedroom, then back to the kitchen, unable to settle anywhere because nowhere felt like home anymore. By morning, I realized that the woman who had begged her husband to love her was gone. In her place sat someone harder, clearer, and infinitely more dangerous to the lies David was living. The 3 days that followed David's disappearance were the darkest of my life. I moved through our house like a ghost, unable to recognize the woman I'd become or the life I'd been living. Every room held memories that now felt like lies. Every photograph on every wall showed a family that I was no longer sure had ever really existed. I stopped showering on the second day. What was the point? There was no one to look good for, no one who would notice or care if I fell apart completely. I stayed in the same clothes I'd worn when David walked out, a soft pink sweater that used to be his favorite on me. Now wrinkled and stained with tears, I couldn't seem to stop crying. The business phone rang constantly. Clients needing updates on projects, suppliers wanting to confirm deliveries, David's crew calling with questions only I could answer. But I couldn't bring myself to pick up and say those familiar words. Martinez Construction, Elena speaking. How could I represent a business built on lies? How could I be the voice of a company whose owner had abandoned me without explanation? By the third day, I found myself sitting on our bedroom floor, surrounded by photo albums I'd pulled from the closet. 25 years of birthdays, anniversaries, family vacations, and holidays spread out around me like evidence in a trial I was losing. I studied every picture, searching for signs I'd missed, moments when David's smile seemed forced or his attention seemed elsewhere. Had he been thinking about another woman when we celebrated our 20th anniversary in Cancun? Was he already planning his escape when we posed for family photos at Sophia's graduation? How many of these seemingly perfect moments were nothing more than performances he'd given while his heart belonged to someone else? The house felt tomb-like, filled with the echoes of conversations that had grown shorter and colder over the months. I sat in David's office, surrounded by files and papers that represented our shared business, our shared life, and felt like I was mourning someone who had died. Except the person who had died was me, the version of myself who had believed in love and partnership and forever. When Sophia called on the third day, I tried to sound normal, but my voice cracked on the first word. Mom, you sound terrible. What's going on? I don't know who I am anymore, mija. I whispered into the phone, surrounded by the debris of my collapsed life. I thought I was a wife, a partner, someone important. But maybe I was just fooling myself. Maybe I've just been a housekeeper he happened to marry. Mom, where's Dad? Is he there? He left 3 days ago after I asked him to talk to me, to try counseling, to just see me as something more than an inconvenience in his life. He hasn't called, hasn't texted. I don't even know if he's planning to come back. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Sophia's voice came through, strong and clear. "Mom, listen to me. You are not a housekeeper. You are not an inconvenience. You are the strongest woman I know. And if Dad can't see that, then he's the one with the problem." But sitting in that empty house, surrounded by the fragments of a life I'd thought was real, I felt anything but strong. I felt erased. Day 4 brought the moment that would change everything, though it started with David's frantic entrance into our kitchen. I was sitting at the table, still in the same clothes I'd worn for 3 days, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The sound of the front door slamming jolted me from my numbness. David burst through the kitchen doorway, his hair disheveled and his clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. For a split second, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe he'd come back to talk, to explain, to fix what we'd broken. Instead, he began tearing through drawers with the desperation of a man running out of time. "Where are my keys?" he muttered, pulling out kitchen utensils and scattering papers across the counter. "Elena, have you seen my spare keys?" I watched him search with the detachment of someone observing a stranger. "Which keys?" "The spare set. I left them here somewhere. I know I did." His voice carried an edge of panic I'd never heard before, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "What do you need spare keys for? You have your regular set." David's hands stilled for just a moment, and something flickered across his face. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "I just need them, okay? It's important." I sat there watching my husband frantically search our kitchen and realized I felt nothing for him. No anger, no hurt, just a cold curiosity about what could make him so desperate. The man who had dismissed my pain as neediness, who had called my contributions to our marriage administrative details, was now falling apart over missing keys. After 20 minutes of searching, David grabbed his main key ring from the counter and headed for the door. "I'll find them later," he said, not meeting my eyes. In his haste, he knocked over a stack of mail, sending envelopes scattering across the floor. I didn't move to help him. I didn't say goodbye. I just watched him leave, noting how he didn't apologize for the mess or ask how I was doing after 3 days of his absence. But David's panic had left something behind. Among the scattered mail on the floor, I found a small silver key that must have fallen from his pocket. A key I recognized from the storage unit receipt I'd found months ago. I picked up the key, feeling its weight in my palm. This tiny piece of metal represented everything David had hidden from me. Everything he'd claimed was nothing important. For months, this storage unit had been his excuse for working late, for being secretive, for growing distant from our marriage. That afternoon, I drove across town to Storage Max, my hands shaking as I navigated streets I'd never traveled to reach a place my husband had kept secret from me. The facility was larger than I'd expected. Rows of identical orange doors, stretching in all directions like a maze of secrets. Unit 247 was in the back corner, isolated from the main walkways. As I stood before that orange metal door, key in hand, I realized this moment would define the rest of my life. Whatever was behind this door would either confirm my fears or prove them wrong. Either way, I would finally know the truth. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door rolled up with a grinding screech that echoed through the empty facility. What I found inside didn't just break my heart. It shattered every assumption I'd made about my life, my marriage, and the man I'd trusted with everything. I sat on the cold concrete floor of that storage unit for nearly 4 hours, methodically going through every box, every receipt, every photograph that documented my husband's systematic betrayal. The woman who had entered broken and questioning her own worth emerged as someone entirely different. Someone who finally understood the game she'd been unknowingly playing. The leather journal was the most devastating discovery. David's handwriting documented 20 years of affairs in meticulous detail. Names, dates, locations, even ratings of his encounters like some sick scorecard. But as I read entry after entry, a strange clarity began to replace my initial shock. This wasn't about me not being enough. This had never been about me at all. David hadn't grown distant because I'd failed as a wife. He'd grown distant because maintaining his lies was becoming harder. He hadn't dismissed my contributions to our business because they weren't valuable. He'd dismissed them because my competence threatened his control. Every time he'd made me feel small, invisible, needy, he'd been protecting himself from the woman who knew his business better than he did. I photographed everything with my phone, every receipt, every letter, every piece of evidence of David's double life. But I wasn't doing it out of rage or a desire for revenge. I was documenting the truth with the methodical precision of someone who finally understood she'd been fighting a war she didn't even know existed. As I worked, memories began recontextualizing themselves. David's late nights weren't about demanding clients. They were about maintaining multiple relationships. His secrecy with his phone wasn't about work stress. It was about juggling lies. His dismissal of my business contributions wasn't about my abilities. It was about keeping me dependent and unaware of my own power. Carmen. Met at the Riverside Hotel bar, told her I was separated. I read this entry dated 3 years ago, remembering how David had worked late that entire week, claiming the Henderson project was behind schedule. I had packed his lunches with extra care, worried about his stress levels. Michelle pregnant. Told her I'd leave Elena soon. This entry was dated 6 months ago, right around the time David had started being particularly cruel about my need for attention and validation. He'd been planning to abandon me while I was desperately trying to save our marriage. But the most revealing entries weren't about his conquests. They were about his fears. Elena asking too many questions about the storage unit. Need to be more careful. Elena noticed me on phone late. Made up story about difficult client. Elena suggested we go to counseling. Can't let that happen. David was afraid of me. He'd always been afraid of me, which is why he'd spent years systematically breaking down my confidence, making me doubt my instincts, convincing me that my needs were unreasonable and my contributions were minimal. I realized that I hadn't been invisible because I was worthless. I'd been kept invisible because I was the greatest threat to his carefully constructed lies. I knew his business inside and out. I knew where every penny came from and went. I had built relationships with clients who respected my judgment and sought my input. I had raised children who trusted my wisdom and sought my guidance. Standing in that storage unit, surrounded by evidence of 20 years of betrayal, I didn't feel destroyed anymore. I felt awakened. The woman David had tried so hard to diminish was still there, had always been there, waiting for the moment when she could finally see clearly. For the first time in months, I knew exactly who I was. Elena Martinez, the architect of everything David was so desperately trying to protect from me. The real question wasn't whether I was strong enough to survive this discovery. The question was whether David was strong enough to survive what came next. The Elena who drove home from that storage unit was not the same woman who had entered it hours earlier. But I made sure nobody could tell the difference. My transformation would be invisible, strategic, and absolutely devastating to the man who had underestimated me for 25 years. The first stop was the bank. I opened a safety deposit box in my name only, something I'd never needed before because David and I had always shared everything. Or so I'd thought. That evening, while David was presumably with whichever woman currently held his attention, I began the meticulous process of photocopying business records. Every client contract that bore my signature alongside his, every financial record that showed my role in building Martinez Construction from a one-man operation into a thriving business, every email chain where clients praised my professionalism and sought my input directly. David thought our business belonged to him, but the paper trail told a different story. I worked methodically, quietly, transforming our home office into a documentation center. Bank statements showing deposits I'd secured through client relationships, insurance policies I'd negotiated, vendor agreements I'd established, tax returns showing my contributions to our income. 25 years of partnership that David could dismiss as administrative details, but that the law would recognize as building a marital estate. My cousin Rosa had divorced her cheating husband 3 years earlier and recommended her attorney, Maria Santos. I made an appointment under my maiden name, Elena Vasquez, not wanting David's name associated with any inquiries yet. Maria's office was in a part of town David never frequented, ensuring our consultations would remain secret. Texas is a community property state, Maria explained during our first meeting. Any business built during the marriage belongs to both spouses equally, regardless of whose name is on the paperwork. Your documented contributions to building this company give you significant leverage. I learned about hidden asset searches, about how adultery could affect property division, about my rights to spousal support and business ownership. But more importantly, I learned that the woman David had trained to feel powerless actually held more cards than he realized. At home, I resumed my normal routine with Oscar-worthy performance. When David finally returned after his 3-day disappearance, I greeted him with the same quiet devotion I'd always shown. "I'm sorry about the other morning," I said, my voice soft and submissive. "You're right. I was being needy. I understand you have responsibilities." David's relief was palpable. He thought he'd successfully beaten me back into submission, that his abandonment had taught me my place. He had no idea I was recording our conversations on the app Maria had recommended, documenting his continued lies and dismissive treatment. I installed a small tracking device in David's truck, perfectly legal since both our names were on the title. I began noting his patterns, which nights he claimed to work late, which weekends he said job sites required attention, which stories he told about where he'd been. But my most important preparation was reconnecting with Sophia and Miguel, not to burden them with their father's betrayals, but to strengthen the relationships David's lies had threatened to undermine. "I've missed our talks, Mija," I told Sophia during one of our coffee dates. "I realize I've been so focused on supporting your father that I haven't been present for you kids the way I should." I was building my support network, documenting my case, and preparing for a battle David didn't even know was coming. Every smile I gave him, every supportive word, every wifely gesture was now camouflage for the woman who was methodically dismantling the life he'd built on lies. The hunter had become the hunted, and David Martinez had no idea. Within 2 weeks of my discovery, cracks began appearing in David's carefully constructed world, and I watched his confidence crumble with the satisfaction of someone who finally understood the game being played. The first sign came when Carmen called our business line on a Thursday morning. I recognized her voice immediately from the voicemails I'd found in one of the storage unit boxes. Breathless, sultry, with a slight accent that made her sound younger than her 32 years. "Is David available?" she asked, her tone carrying an intimacy that made my skin crawl. "I'm sorry, he's on a job site today," I replied with my usual professional warmth. "May I take a message?" "Just tell him Carmen called. He'll know what it's about." There was a pause, then frustration crept into her voice. "Actually, could you have him call me back today? It's important." "Of course. Is there a number where he can reach you?" She rattled off digits I'd memorized from the love letters in her box. After hanging up, I dutifully wrote down her message and placed it where David would see it. Then I watched him read it that evening, his face paling as he quickly shoved the note into his pocket. David returned Carmen's call from his truck in our driveway, but I could hear his voice through our bedroom window, tense, apologetic, trying to manage what sounded like a very unhappy woman. More calls followed from other names I recognized. Michelle, sounding tearful and urgent. Lisa, demanding to know why he wasn't answering her texts. Jennifer, asking pointed questions about promises he'd apparently made. David's phone became a source of constant stress rather than secret pleasure. Meanwhile, our business began experiencing problems David had never faced before. For 25 years, I'd been the invisible foundation that made everything work smoothly. Now I continued performing my duties, but with strategic modifications. When Mrs. Henderson called with concerns about her kitchen renovation timeline, instead of immediately soothing her worries and coordinating with David, I said, "Let me have Mr. Martinez call you directly to discuss those details." Mrs. Henderson's response was telling. "Oh, but Elena, you're the one who understands the project timeline. David seemed confused when I spoke to him last week." I began systematically directing client communications back to David, forcing him to handle relationships he'd grown dependent on me to manage. Bills I typically paid arrived past due, because David didn't know our vendor payment schedules. Equipment deliveries were missed because David wasn't tracking orders I'd always coordinated. The Riverside Community Center project, our biggest contract of the year, nearly fell apart when David showed up to the wrong location for a critical meeting. I'd always managed his calendar, confirmed his appointments, sent him detailed directions. Without my invisible support, David's carefully maintained image of competence began to unravel. Most satisfying was watching David struggle with the very technology he'd used to deceive me. His phone, once a source of secret joy, became a constant source of anxiety. He'd check it compulsively, his face growing more stressed with each message. Multiple women were now demanding his attention simultaneously, and he lacked the skills to juggle them all successfully. During our neighborhood barbecue at the Rodriguez family's house, I watched David field 3 different phone calls, each one requiring him to step away and speak in hushed, urgent tones. When he returned from the 3rd call, his shirt was damp with sweat despite the cool evening. "Everything okay, David?" asked our neighbor Miguel Santos. "You seem stressed lately." "Just busy with work," David replied, but his hands shook as he reached for his beer. I smiled serenely, playing the supportive wife while internally documenting every crack in his facade. The man who had made me feel powerless was discovering just how much power I'd always held. I chose Friday evening for our confrontation, after David returned from what he claimed was a late client meeting. I'd spent the day preparing mentally, emotionally, and strategically. The dining room table was set with the evidence I'd gathered: photographs, receipts, bank statements, and printed copies of his journal entries, all organized in neat folders like a business presentation. David walked through our front door at 9:30, his hair slightly disheveled, and his cologne stronger than it had been that morning. He looked surprised to find me waiting in the living room, still dressed in the blue dress I'd worn to my meeting with Maria Santos that afternoon. "Elena, you're still up. I thought you'd be asleep by now." "How was your evening with Michelle?" I asked calmly, my voice steady and clear. David froze halfway through hanging up his jacket. "What did you say?" I stood up slowly, holding the storage unit key between my fingers where he could see it. I said, "How was your evening with Michelle? The same Michelle whose pregnancy test is in box number 3 of storage unit 247? The color drained from David's face so quickly I thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and his hand instinctively moved toward his pocket where he kept his phone, the phone that had been buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from multiple women all week. "Elena, I can explain. 20 years, David." I walked toward the dining room, gesturing for him to follow. 20 years of other women while I built your business, raised your children, and made your life possible. David followed me with the slow, heavy steps of a condemned man. When he saw the evidence spread across our dining room table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of family meals, his legs gave out and he sank into a chair. "Carmen, Lisa, Michelle, Jennifer, Maria, Rachel," I said, pointing to each folder. "Should I continue? Because there are 8 more boxes in that storage unit, and I photographed everything." I placed printed copies of hotel receipts in front of him. The Riverside Hotel, charged to our business account. The same account I manage, the same business I helped you build from nothing. David's hands shook as he stared at the evidence of his betrayals. "Elena, please let me explain. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think." I sat across from him, my voice never wavering, never rising. "I know about the jewelry purchased with money I helped earn. I know about the promises you made to leave me. I know about Michelle's pregnancy and Carmen's demands for more commitment." I opened the final folder, copies of his handwritten journal entries. I especially enjoyed reading about how you rated your conquests, how you planned your lies, how afraid you were that I might discover the truth. David tried to rally, falling back on the manipulation tactics that had worked for decades. "Elena, you're overreacting. These women don't mean anything to me. You're my wife, the mother of my children." "The administrative assistant you happened to marry," I corrected, using his own words from the church dinner. "The woman whose contributions you've spent years minimizing while she made your double life possible." David's face crumpled as the full magnitude of his situation became clear. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the systematic dismantling of everything he'd taken for granted. "Our marriage is over, David," I said, with the calm finality of someone who had already grieved what was lost. "The only question now is how difficult you want to make this for everyone involved, including Sophia and Miguel." The man who had made me feel small and invisible now looked utterly powerless himself. David spent the weekend trying to salvage what he could from the wreckage of his exposed lies, but every attempt only revealed how thoroughly he'd underestimated the woman he'd spent years diminishing. "Elena, please," he said Sunday morning, finding me in the kitchen preparing coffee for one instead of two. "These affairs, they didn't mean anything. I never stopped loving you. We can work through this, go to counseling, start over. I'll do whatever it takes." I turned to face him, noting how small he looked in his rumpled clothes, his hair unwashed, his confident swagger replaced by desperate pleading. "David, you told Michelle you were leaving me. You promised Carmen you'd divorce me within 6 months. You rated your sexual encounters in a journal like you were reviewing restaurants. Which part of that suggests love?" I was confused, going through a midlife crisis. Men do stupid things for 20 years? "David, our youngest affair partner was Sophia's age. This isn't a midlife crisis. This is who you are." David tried a different approach, one that had always worked before, making me feel dependent and powerless. "You can't just leave, Elena. You need me. You haven't worked in 20 years. Who's going to hire a woman your age with no recent experience?" The smile that crossed my face seemed to unnerve him more than any tears could have. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder Maria Santos had prepared. "Actually, David, I've been working for 20 years. I've been working for you." I handed him the first document. "This is a contract from the Henderson Construction Group. They've agreed to continue their partnership with Martinez Construction under my leadership, effective immediately." David's face went white as he read the letterhead. The Hendersons were our biggest client, representing nearly 30% of our annual revenue. I handed him the second document. "The Riverside Community Center project? They've requested that I personally oversee the completion. Apparently, they've always considered me the real project manager." "That's impossible. They can't just—" The third document is from St. Mary's Church renovation project. Father Rodriguez was quite clear that he'd prefer to work with me directly, given my attention to detail and communication skills. Each contract David read made him smaller, more desperate. The business relationships he'd assumed belonged to him were revealing their true foundation: my work, my competence, my professionalism. "Elena, you can't take my clients. This is my business." "Our business," I corrected. "Built during our marriage with my labor. In Texas, that makes it community property. My attorney has been very educational about asset division, especially when adultery is involved." But my final revelation was the most devastating. I placed a printed email on the table between us and watched David's face crumble as he recognized the sender. "Carmen sent this yesterday," I said calmly. "She's 12 weeks pregnant, David. Congratulations. You're going to be a father again at 55. David's hands shook as he read Carmen's demands: child support, medical expenses, recognition of paternity. But there was more. "She's also quite upset that you've been ignoring her calls this week. Apparently, she's been in contact with Michelle, and they've discovered they're not the only ones who believed your promises about leaving your wife." The phone in David's pocket buzzed, and his face went gray. "Your girlfriends are comparing notes, David. They're realizing they've all been played just like I was. Carmen mentioned something about a Facebook group." David's carefully compartmentalized world was collapsing into a single, explosive mess that he couldn't control, couldn't manage, and couldn't escape. The man who had juggled multiple relationships while keeping me isolated and powerless was about to learn what it felt like to be surrounded by angry women who knew the truth. 3 months after filing for divorce, I was settling into my new apartment across town when David appeared at my door on a rainy Thursday evening. Through the peephole, I could see he looked haggard, thinner than I'd ever seen him, his usually well-groomed appearance replaced by wrinkled clothes and hollow eyes. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "What do you want, David?" "Elena, please, just 5 minutes. I need to talk to you." His voice cracked on the words, and I could smell alcohol on his breath. Something that would have alarmed the old Elena, the woman who used to fix his problems and shield him from consequences. "You have 5 minutes. I've ended everything, all of it." David's words tumbled out in a desperate rush. "Carmen, Michelle, all of them. I told them it's over, that I made terrible mistakes. It's just you now, Elena. It's always been you." I studied the man I'd been married to for 25 years, noting how his hands shook and how his eyes darted around my new space, a bright, airy apartment I'd chosen and decorated entirely to my own taste, with no input from anyone else. "You ended your affairs because I discovered them, not because you wanted to," I said calmly. "There's a difference. I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But Elena, we have 25 years together. We have children, grandchildren someday. We can rebuild this. I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever you need." David stepped closer, and I could see tears in his eyes. Real tears, born of genuine desperation. The powerful, confident man who had dismissed my needs for months was now begging for mercy from the woman he'd systematically tried to diminish. "I've been lost without you," he continued. "The business is falling apart. I can't keep track of the schedules, the client meetings, the vendor payments. I never realized how much you did, how much I depended on you for everything." "You're not hearing me, David," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "This isn't about them anymore. This isn't about your affairs or your lies or your broken promises. This is about me." I moved to close the door slightly, creating a physical barrier between us. "For the first time in decades, I know who I am without you, and I like her. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not hurt anymore. I'm simply done." David tried tears, promises, declarations of love that might have moved me months earlier. "Elena, I love you. I've always loved you. I just got confused, made terrible choices. But you're my wife, my partner." "I was your wife," I corrected. "I was your partner when you needed someone to build your business and raise your children and manage your life. But I was also your cover story, your excuse, your safety net while you lived exactly as you pleased." Just then, Sophia's car pulled into the parking lot. She'd been visiting more often since I'd moved out, and David's face brightened with hope when he saw our daughter approaching. "Sophia, mija, talk to your mother. Help her see that families work through problems together." Sophia looked from her father to me, then back to her father. "Dad, Mom's not the same person you could dismiss and ignore. Maybe you should have thought about that before you threw away the best thing that ever happened to you." "Your mother needs me." "No, Dad," Sophia said quietly. "You needed her. There's a difference." I squeezed my daughter's hand, grateful for her support, but no longer needing anyone to fight my battles for me. The woman David had trained to be dependent was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to stand completely alone. 10 months after discovering David's storage unit of lies, I sit in the corner office of Martinez Family Services, watching the sunrise paint golden streaks across the windows. I chose for this space I built with my own hands and my own vision. The morning light illuminates the certificates on my wall, my business license, my notary certification, and a framed copy of the first contract I signed as an independent businesswoman. My client this morning is Isabella Rodriguez, a 34-year-old teacher whose husband has been working late and hiding his phone. A story that echoes my own so precisely it takes my breath away. She sits across from my desk, twisting her wedding ring the same way I used to, her voice barely above a whisper as she describes feeling invisible in her own marriage. "I feel crazy for even being here," Isabella says, tears threatening to spill. "Maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe I'm just being paranoid and needy." "You're not crazy," I tell her, my voice carrying the authority of someone who's walked this path and emerged stronger. "And you're not powerless, even when someone tries to make you feel like you are." I've heard variations of Isabella's story dozens of times since opening my practice. Women who've sacrificed their careers, their identities, their sense of self-worth for men who took their devotion for granted while pursuing their own selfish desires. Each consultation reminds me that my discovery in that storage unit wasn't just about my marriage. It was about reclaiming my life. My phone buzzes with a text from Miguel. "Proud of you, Mom? Lunch tomorrow to celebrate your 6-month business anniversary?" My son has visited twice since I moved out, both times expressing amazement at the transformation he's witnessed in me. "You're like the mom I remember from when I was little," he said during his last visit. "Happy, confident, yourself." Sophia stops by most weekends, often bringing friends who need advice about their own relationship struggles. Last Saturday, she brought her new boyfriend to meet me, and I caught her introducing me with obvious pride. "This is my mom. She built her own business after 25 years of marriage. She's kind of my hero." The divorce was finalized last month. David tried to fight for the business, the house, even spousal support, but Maria Santos had prepared our case meticulously. The judge was particularly unimpressed with David's claim that he deserved the majority of our assets, while simultaneously arguing he couldn't afford child support for Carmen's baby. Carmen's son was born 3 weeks ago. David now has 3 children by 2 different women, financial obligations he never planned for, and a reputation in our community that will take years to rebuild, if it ever can be. Outside my office window, I can see the Storage Max facility across the street. I didn't choose this location by accident. Every morning, I drive past the place where my old life ended and my new one began, and I feel nothing but gratitude for the key David accidentally left behind. That storage unit had been David's monument to deception, but it became my gateway to truth. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing that could have happened. You just have to be strong enough to walk through the door when it opens. I am Elena Martinez. I am 53 years old, single, successful, and for the first time in decades, completely and authentically myself. And I have never been happier.